Today's daf we're going to be learning is Nazir, daf kaf aleph. There's a study guide which will help in terms of the structure of today's daf. We started with the Mishna yesterday. Let's just quickly review the Mishna. Somebody says, I am a Nazir, and then another person says, and me, and another person says, and me. We raised that there were a bunch of questions, both within that case and within the case of if a woman takes panizirud and then her husband says, and me, then we said he can't cancel, he can't nullify her vow. Okay, which we suggested two possibilities, which we'll see today why exactly he can't nullify her vow. In the first case, there was also some lack of clarity because the first case said, I say I'm a Nazir, then you said and me, and then your friend says and me. Is the and me referring back to you, or is it referring back to me, the first person? So we're going to ask that question in the Gemara further on. I'm going to try to infer it from the language in the Mishna. I want to already point out, because it's going to be a little bit confusing later, but the Mishnah gives us two scenarios, where really there's three scenarios. So the Mishnah says, let's start from the beginning. Mishamar hareini nazil. I said I'm going to be a Nazir. V'shamar chavero v'amar vani. You said ani, and then your friend said ani. Kulam nizirim. That's pretty simple. But here comes the complicated part. Hutal lisham hutul kulam. If I undo my vow, undoing vows goes back, basically erases it from the beginning. So that's hatarat nidarim, as opposed to hafarat nidarim, which we're not sure, which is going to be a question we're going to ask today. But hatarat nidarim, I undid my vow. Well, then guess what? I erased it from the beginning, so none of you are nizirim anymore. But hutah ha'acharon, but if the third person undid their vow, ha'acharon mutar v'kulam asurim. The last one is not a Nazir anymore, but everybody else still is. Now, what's missing from the Mishnah is what about the middle person? Now, if you take the first line, Hutar rishon tru kulam, only if I undid it is everyone else. But if the second person, you, who undid yours, it has no effect on anyone else. Or you could say, let's infer from the second line. Ha'acharon mutal, if the third person undoes it, then only the acharon is permitted. But the rest are still nazirim, which would imply that if the middle one did it, then the third one wouldn't be a Nazir either. And that all depends on this question the Gemara is going to ask, which is, when number three said and me, did they mean and me to the and me of the second person? And therefore, if the second person disappears, then their neder, their nazirut is gone also. Or were they all just saying and me to the first person? And therefore, if the second one undoes their vow, it's irrelevant to anybody else because that person did it just alone. That's the big question that's going to be asked in the beginning of the Gemara about how we understand this. Then we saw the Gemara, and the Gemara said that Reish Lakish says all this ve'ani has to be toch dibur. It has to be immediate, right? If you said it immediately after, then it's good. If you didn't say it immediately after, then it doesn't work. Because I could say, right, we gave the extreme example. I could go tomorrow and say, and me. Well, what was that and me referring to? So as long as it's toch dibur, then it works. So the first thing we're going to do today is try to prove Reish Lakish. We're going to try to prove it from two Tannaitic sources. Today is going to be a big Tannaitic source day. We're going to bring a lot of Tannaitic sources. Our structure is incredibly simple today. First thing we're going to do is deal with Reish Lakish. Two attempts to prove his point. One will be successful, one won't be. Then we're going to bring our question, which I mentioned already, which is when each one says and me, are they referring to person number one, or are they referring to the person who said ve'ani just before them? And then the Gemara is going to say, what's the relevance? They're going to give the relevance, why it would be relevant to know which way it works. And then they're going to try to prove it. They're going to bring four different sources to prove it. Only when they get, and three are from our Mishnah, only when they get to source number four are they going to actually have an answer. And there it's going to be actually clear. Then we're going to deal with this one case very briefly where it says, Pi kapi vusali kasali. My mouth is like his mouth. My hair is like his hair. You're a Nazir. Gemara is going to bring a contradictory Tannaitic source and say, how could that possibly be? Seems to contradict some other source. And then they're going to resolve it. And then we're going to go to question number 2 of today, which is also going to be quoting Tannaitic source after Tannaitic source, trying to get to an answer, again, starting with our Mishnah, but then already moving on to 2 other Tannaitic sources, which is when a husband nullifies his wife's vows, and this is a question we've seen a number of times, is it like hatarat nidarim, where it basically erases it from the beginning, or is it only that he cuts it from here moving forward? That's going to be our second question. So there's 2 big questions on today's daf with 2 small sugyot, this proving Reish Lakish and trying to understand that line in the Mishnah. So with that, let's go to our daf. Tanya nami hachi. Tanya nami hachi is a word, and we're going to particularly point out the two words that introduce these two Tanaic sources that are very important. Tanya nami hachi means I'm bringing a braita to support this. So you know you're going to have a support, and usually it's not rejected. So here's a braita to prove what Reish Lakish says. Again, Reish Lakish said it all has to happen toch dibur, immediately, within the amount of time it takes to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi. Misha amar hareini Nazir v'shama chavero v'shaha dibur v'amar v'ani. If I said I'm a Nazir, and then you waited more than the time of kidei dibur, then it's of normal speech, which we'll see what that means in a second when we already know, but the braita is going to express it. And I waited that long amount of time, and then I said v'ani, the first person's a Nazir, but if I said v'ani and I waited too long, I'm not a Nazir. V'kama kidei dibur, the braita continues. How long is kidei dibur? Kidei she'elat shalom tamid l'chav. The way a student says hello to his rabbi. There you have it, proof for Reish Lakish. Now we're going to try to bring a second proof. And you already know from the words that are introducing this proof that it's not going to work. Because it says, Lema Mesayale. Lema Mesayale means, let us suggest that this also could be provided as support. But Lema is often, almost always, rejected. So here goes our source. And it happens to be our Mishna. Misha amar hareini Nazir v'shama chavero v'amar v'ani. That's our Mishnah. I said I'm a Nazir, you said and me, and then your friend said and me. Now, what's the diuk here? How are they going to learn about toch dibur? Very interesting proof. V'tulo. Notice it doesn't say v'ani, right? It doesn't go into 5, 6, 7, 8 people. It only says 2 people. Why does it only say 2 people? Because once you get past 2, it's no longer going to be toch dibur. By the way, this assumes you're holding that everyone's matpiece on the first guy, because it all has to be toch dibur of hareini Nazir. And if you start saying v'ani, and then someone else says v'ani, by the time the third person says v'ani, it's already not going to be toch dibur within that very small frame of time that the first person said hareini Nazir. So there you see, the fact that the tanna only said 2 v'anis and didn't go on farther must be a proof that toch dibur, it has to be toch dibur. And that basically the only possible circumstance you could have is 2 people maximum. To which the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Tanna kiruch lalichsha v'liza. This comes up a few other situations where they're trying to specify, the Tanna specifically said this, that, counted those cases. Is the Tanna like a peddler that counts his inventory all the time? Right? A peddler is always counting numbers, right? How many did I sell? How many are left? How many? Always doing exact calculations. Tanaim don't do calculations. That's not their field. When the Tanna mentions v'ani 2 times, it's not like they wanted to do specifically 2 times and not any more than 2 times. That's not the way Tanaim work. So therefore, it's kind of like saying, don't take this too seriously, the fact that he gave 2. It was just kind of somewhat random. To which the Gemara says, wait, if you're going to say it's somewhat random, and the Tanna doesn't, and what they're really saying is more than just random, the Tanna doesn't give every possible permutation. Okay, this comes up, by the way, in Gittim, when it's talking about Shemitah. And it says that the Dayanim says, Hadayanim, what does it say? Ploni uploni hadayanim. And they try to prove, because it says ploni uploni, that's 2 people. They try to prove that a court in that situation, even though it's normally 3, it could be only 2. To which they say, but the Tanna is, you think the Tanna was saying ploni uploni specifically? They were counting? No, they were just saying so-and-so and so-and-so, and obviously they meant, and a third one. They just didn't need to spell everything out. So it's, again, the same idea here, which is, do you think, right, just because it said v'ani doesn't mean exactly 2 times and no more. To which the Gemara says, okay, well, if the Tanna's purpose is not to start saying 1, 2, 3, exactly how many, it could have just said, if you say hareini Nazir, and I said hareini Nazir, I'm a Nazir, and you said v'ani, we could have gotten to the entire case of the Mishnah, right? Let's look at the Mishnah again. I said I'm a Nazir, you said v'ani, kulam nizirim. We're both nizirim. In this case, you wouldn't say kulam, you would say we're both, because it's only 2. Now, what did the Mishnah continue to say? Let's see, could we do it with just one case? You could. Hutar harishon hutru kulam. If I got rid of my neder, my nizirut, you would also not be in the Sibah. Hutar acharon, if you did it though, hacharon mutar v'kulam salim, then you would be not a Nazir anymore, but I would still be a Nazir. You could have just done it with one. So if the purpose of the tanna is not to list every single possibility, why did they bother listing two possibilities when they could have just listed one person who said the ani? Would have been the same thing. So which the Gemara answers, hachanam. Really, it could have just listed one. But why did they list two? For a different reason. Mishum de katani seifa, utar lishon utru kulam, utar acharon utar b'kulam asulim, because it said, if the first one undoes it, this is what happens. If the last one undoes it, this is what happens. Therefore, michlal de'ika emtzai, because it talked about first and last implies that there's also a possibility of the middle person. They wanted specifically a situation with three people, so that you know what happens if number one undoes it, number two undoes it, and number three undoes it. Now, the problem with this answer is it's a really weak answer. Why? Because the whole problem is we don't know what happens if the middle one undoes it. That's the whole lack of clarity here, and we're going to get to that in a minute or two when we get to the next question, which is everyone matpis in the first person? Are they connecting it to Harini Nazir, or are they connecting it to the person before? And that's going to affect what happens with this middle person. The middle person undoes it if 3 was dependent on 2 and 2 undoes their neder, then 3 won't be a Nazir. But if 3 is dependent on 1, kind of bypasses 2, and 2 is not relevant to him, then if 2 undoes their Nazirut, 3 is going to still be a Nazir. So it's a bit of a weird answer. And we're going to actually play out both scenarios later, because if you just had hutar harishon hutru kulam, right? The first one's mutar, everyone's mutar, because everyone's dependent on the first, right? Because even, you could say domino effect, even if 3 is dependent on 2, 2 is dependent on 1. So you get rid of 1, nobody's a Nazir. If you took just that line, you could infer about the middle case, but if it was the middle person, then only the middle person's not a Nazir. Alternatively, you can infer from ha'acharon mutar kulam asulim, if it's the last one is permitted, undoes his vow, everyone else is still forbidden. But if the middle one undoes it, then actually that would affect the last person. So the fact is, the way we have to understand this Gemara is it did talk about 3 people because it wanted you to infer something. We just don't know what the Mishna wanted you to infer. The Mishna wanted you to infer something about the middle person, that it's either not like the first person undoing it, or it's not like the last person undoing it. We just don't know which one. So, and we're going to talk about this lack of clarity further on. We're going to have this exact wording of the sugya in another minute or two. Okay. Again, what did we do with the sugya? We tried to bring our Mishna to prove Reish Lakish to toch dibur. Why? Because we looked at the fact that the Mishna gave particularly 2 examples and not more. If it brought more, you would have thought maybe it doesn't have to be toch dibur. In fact, it brought exactly 2 shows. It must have to be toch dibur, and that's why 2 is the only option. That's the maximum. To which the Gemara, not the only option, but the maximum amount of options. To which the Gemara said no. Tanna isn't so specific about how many people they list. It doesn't mean exactly only that number. To which the Gemara said, well, if they're not so specific, why did they add 2 then? So it's like a question on the rejection of that source. Why did they just say 1? And the answer is because they wanted you to infer something, even though we don't know what it is, something about the middle case. Okay, but we don't really know which one they wanted you to infer, but they obviously had something in mind that they just didn't make clear to us. So now the Gemara says, Ibayalu, here goes our question. So that was, again, section. Reish Lakish said toch dibur, it all has to be within that time frame. Then we had a proof from a braita. We tried to prove from our Mishna, but we're unsuccessful. Ibayalu. Now we ask the question we've been talking about. When everyone else keeps saying, and me, and me, and me, and me, are they referring back to the person who just took it upon just before them, right, in the order? And me, and me, and me, and me. So whoever said and me last was referring to the person just before them who said and me. Or, Odilma Bekama Mikpase, or were they all saying Hareini Nazir? They're all going back to the first person who said Hareini Nazir. So every time I said and me, you were really referring back to the original person who said Hareini Nazir. L'may nafkamina, what's the relevance of this question? Okay, like I said, we're going to have 2 questions today. Both are going to have the same structure. We're going to ask the question. We're going to say what's the relevance of the question, and then we're going to try to attempt to bring sources to answer the question. Lat puse umezal. Well, can you keep going forever? So if each one is connecting it back to the one before them, mitbasina vazlina leolam. Okay, as long as everyone is toch dibur of the one before them, you could go on all day long. You could go on till tomorrow. You could go on as long as you want, because everyone can keep saying and me, and me, and me, and me. And the fact that it's not toch dibur of the first one is irrelevant, because each one is connecting to the previous person. So as long as they're within toch dibur of the person before them, you could just keep going and have one person said Areni Nazir, and that could turn 150 people into Nazirim, as long as each one says Va'ani within toch dibur of the one who said it before that. But if you say it's the first person they're all referring back to, and then kind of like what we said before, it would be about two maybe who would be able to do it, right? Unless obviously they all speak simultaneously, then you could have it. But we're not talking about where people speak simultaneously. We're assuming each one said it one after the other. So what is it? Here goes our attempt, as I told you before, three sources, basically 3 lines from our Mishnah. We're going to try to derive it from 3 different things in our Mishnah. In the end, we're going to be unsuccessful. And then we're going to actually find a source where it says it explicitly. Tashma, let's learn it from here. Tashma introduces another source. It's an introduction to a source, which could be for an answer, it could be for a question, it could be, right, in our case, it's obviously going to be for an answer because we asked a question. So you know the Tashma is going to bring in a source to try to answer that question. This sugya is going to be exactly what we said before. Vitu lomidi. Notice it stops after 2. Why does it stop after 2? Shma mina. It must be they're all going back to the Hareni Nazir originally. Because if you thought that each one is going back to the one just before him, litni tuba vani, the Mishnah could have listed vani, 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 right? The fact that it picks only 2, which we already know they're going to reject this because we already rejected this is proof. This is a good example of when the sugya talks as if you didn't just read the previous sugya, okay? Because at this point, they're in the same place they were in the beginning of the previous one, where they tried to use this as a proof that it used 2 exactly when, in the end, we're going to say it's not true. So again, the Gemara is going to reject this. So our attempt is to say only 2 because each one is referring back to Hareni Nazir, and it all has to be toch dibur of the first acceptance of Nazirut. But again, the Gemara is going to reject and say, Tana kiruchla lichshav. What is the Tana like a peddler that is so specific in how many people they count? No, they were just giving examples. It could have been a lot more. To which the Gemara says, well, if they don't really care, then you should have just had 1 and not more than 1. Why'd you bring 2 people who said Vani? Could have learned it all. You just had 1. Then total repeat of what we saw. To which the Gemara says, again, because they differentiated between the first and the last, in terms of if one undoes, how does that affect all the others? And it's a different halacha. It must be there's a middle one, which is either not like the first person or not like the last person. We don't really know. Again, there's 2 tracks of which way to go. Tosfot says it well. Tosfot kind of asks this question. It doesn't really help you because it said last this and it said first this, and it doesn't, you can't really infer anything from Emsa, right? So Tosfot basically said it depends which track you go on. If you think the middle one, right, it all depends on how you answer this question. If you say each one is mutpas b'chavero, the one before, then the middle one will be differentiated from the last one, because then 3 will be dependent on 2. You'll get rid of 2, it'll get rid of 3, and that's different from 3, who undoes it and is only relevant for 3. If you say it all goes back to the first person, then 2 is going to be just like the Acharon, and we're going to have the Rishon to differentiate it from the middle and the last. So again, it kind of really depends on how you answer this question. So, Mishum Hachi Katami Vani, Vani, that's why it brought you 2. It had to give you 2 to show you there's a difference between, right, 1, 2, and 3, okay? The first person, the second person, the third person, they have different laws. But again, what the difference is, we don't really know where the Emsai falls at. Tashma. Now we're going to start making our inferences from either the Hutar Rishon line or the Hutar Haron line. But each is going to be a new attempted answer. So Hutar Rishon Utru Kulam, which sounds like only if you undid the first one, does that affect other of the people? Rishon Hudashari, it's only the first person who basically, once you get rid of their neder, everyone else disappears. Ha'emtsa'i lo, which would seem to infer, again, this is what I told you can infer one thing or the other. But from here you can infer the middle one, it wouldn't be the case, meaning the first one, positive, right? Everyone is connected to the first one. but no one's connected to the second one, because when 3 says Vani, he was referring all the way back to the first person. Shma mina bekama metapsim. So from here you learn, like they tried to derive in the previous one, they all go back to the first one. Okay, so the first 2 attempts were to try to say, everyone really is going back to, okay, if we take my example, I said Hareini Nizira, everyone who said Vani was referring back to me. Otherwise, it wouldn't only be Rishon, it would also be Emtsai, would affect other people when they undo their vow. To which the Gemara says, no, you don't have to read it that way. So you could read it as 3 was dependent on 2, 4 was dependent on 3, 5 was dependent on 4, etc. If they wanted to tell you, the question here is, why, if that's the case, okay, so in the Mishnah talked about 3 people, me, you, and your friend. And the Mishnah said, if I undo my vow, none of you are nizir. The fact is, again, this is what they're trying to suggest. If the fact is that when you undo your vow, also your friend is not a Nazir anymore, shouldn't it have given you that case? Because that's a bigger, what you say, bigger chidush. It would be, right, because that's exactly what we don't know what the halach is. So if they had told you that, it would be obvious that if I undid mine, all of you would be. So why didn't they bring that case if that was the case? They say the following. Because they wanted to say hutul kulan. They wanted a simple case. If you undo your vow, it gets a little complicated, because what happens? You and the person after you, number 3, is not a Nazir, but I am still a Nazir. So it's not a good clear-cut case. They'd rather bring a case like me where you could just say hutul kulan. And it's very easy. You just say, oh, I undo mine, everyone disappears, and no one's a Nazir anymore. So that's what we're going to read inside. So again, I'm going to start with Emelacha. You could say, this is all possibilities. We don't know really what the Mishnah meant. We're just suggesting possibilities, which then means we can't use this to prove what you tried to prove from. It's really, everyone's connected to the person just before them. And really, if number 2 undid their Nizirut, number 3 would not be a Nazir either. But I did by mitne hutul kulam, because they wanted to give a case where everyone is no longer a Nazir. Therefore, they gave the case if I undo mine, case if number 1 does it. Ti'itana emtsai, if we brought you as the example, then you as number 2, ikarishon de lo mishtere. You would end up with, right? Number 3 wouldn't be a Nazir, and number 2 wouldn't be a Nazir, but number 1 would still be a Nazir, and that already is a more complicated case. So therefore, mishumapi katani rishon. That's why they said only if the first one. But you can't infer from there that if the middle one undoes it, that it doesn't affect anybody else. So we're back to square one. We don't have an answer. Because again, all these sources could be read in different ways. Tashma, now we're going to try to bring it from the next line in the Mishnah and infer the opposite, right? So, Tashma hutar charon, charon mutar b'kulam asalim. When you undo the last one, then only they're not a Nazir anymore, but everyone else is still a Nazir. Because there's no one after them. Haval emtsai, but you, number 2, since there is someone after you, you would say mishtere. So again, it all depends whether you infer from the beginning or the end. You infer from the last person, then you infer just the last person has no effects on anyone else. But number 2, 3 was dependent on 2, so 3 is no longer a Nazir either. From here now, okay, in the first 2 attempts, we tried to say it all goes back to me. But in this case, we're trying to say in source number 3, we're going to try to prove the opposite. Everyone's depending on their nizirut on the person who spoke before them. To which the Gemara says, no, you don't necessarily need to infer that. No, you could still say, even from this line, you could still say everyone goes back to the first person. Umay acharon de katane, here's an interesting reading. Emtsai, when it says acharon, last in the Mishnah, they don't mean last. Last is relative. Like sometimes we have a reisha and a seifa, which means the beginning and the beginning of the source and the end of the source, but really they're just comparing 2 of the parts of that source, and the seifa is really the middle, or the reisha could be the middle. It's all relative. When it says acharon, it means anyone after the rishon, really. And it means the second one. If the second one undoes it, no one else is affected by it because everyone goes back to the first person. So I did tani rishon, tana achron. Why they call it achron instead of emtsai, right? In other words, there's 3 people in our Mishnah. You call them by first, middle, last. That would be pretty obvious. Why would you call the middle person the last person? Because Since it started with first, it wanted to give you the opposite. It said last, but really it meant anyone after the middle, anyone after the first person, which would include the middle person. So basically, right, we're left with no clarity at all from our Mishnah, which doesn't surprise us, because when we read our Mishnah, we already pointed out that it was totally unclear. But now, as I promised you, we're going to have a source that says it explicitly, and not only does it say it explicitly, the Gemara tells us that the source says it explicitly. Tashma de Tanya behedya. Usually the word Tanya, you know that immediately we're going to start a braita, but in this case, with the word Tanya, okay, sometimes they'll say Tanya namihachi, so that's also an example where that was started our daf, where you see the word Tanya, but it doesn't yet appear the braita because it's saying there's a braita just like this. Here they're saying there's a braita that's explicit. It says exactly what we've been looking for this whole time. As I mentioned before, why didn't they say it before? Right? So either they didn't know about its existence at the time they were having this discussion, or maybe they wanted to really delve into our Mishnah and show all the possibilities before they got to the easy answer. So Tashma, the Tanya Behedya, and by the way, there's a third reason why maybe they didn't bring the source. The third reason is just because there's a Tanaitic source that says it explicitly doesn't mean that all the Tanaim agree with this. Sometimes you have Tanaitic sources that reflect one person's view. Doesn't necessarily mean it's everybody's view. So that's another possibility. In any case, here you're going to have it, and it's going to be very obvious. And you're saying, why did we go bend over backwards trying to read the Mishnah in so many different complicated ways when here it says it right explicitly? Okay, again, we're talking about, I said I'm a Nazir, you said and me, and your friend said and me. So if I undo my nizirut, hutru kulam, obviously no one else is a Nazir because you were all dependent on me. Even if 3 was dependent on 2, 2 was dependent on 1, so they were all dependent. Like I said, domino effect. Hutar ha'acharon mutar b'kulam asurim. The last one, we already know this. No one's dependent on the last one for sure. So when the last one undoes their nizirut, just the last one is not a Nazir, everyone else still is. Here we're going to have it now. Hutar emsa'i. What if the middle person, you undid your nizirut? How does that affect things? Hemenu ulamata mutal. Anyone after you is permitted. Number 3, if there's a number 4, if there's a number 5, because again, domino effect. Each one was dependent on the one before, which eventually was dependent on you. Hemenu ulamala, but anyone before you is a sul because they weren't dependent on you. Shma mina. So here we clearly infer b'chavrei matpis shma mina. Each one is matpis b'chavero. So if we go back to the structure, we took 3 different parts of our Mishnah. Number 1, how many cases were listed? Ani va'ani, only 2 cases. We thought that would prove that everyone's going back to the original person. Then we tried to prove for the first line, Rishon, that Rishon hutar hutru kulam, but not the second one. And also that was trying to prove everyone goes back to case number 1, the first person who said Areini Nazir. Then we tried to prove from the last part, Acharon, only that person's mutar, everyone else is still asur. That means that anyone before them would still be, would affect other people. And then we switched to trying to prove each one is basically connecting to the one before. And then we actually prove that explicitly from a braita. Okay, so we basically have case 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Attempts. The first 2 tried to prove they all went back to the first person. And the second 2 tried to prove each one just was connecting to the person just before them. And in the end, only from source number 4 were we actually able to prove that. And I see you're asking if this is complicated. Yes, this is complicated, okay? It's not so complicated. The structure is pretty clear, but how they keep inferring different things from the sources and the back and forth is a little bit complicated. Next section. This is actually much more straightforward. Hareini Nazir, v'shamach havero ba'amar pi kipi v'sari kesaro. You say I'm going to be a Nazir. I say I'm going to be a Nazir. You say my mouth is like your mouth. My hair is like your hair. You're a Nazir. Which the Gemara says, I don't get this. Mishum da'amar pi kipi v'sari kesaro re Nazir. You said your mouth is like mine. Your hair is like mine. You're a Nazir. Ulemini. Now moving to Amud Bet. But this contradicts an explicit source. Yadi Nazira v'ragli Nazira lo amar klu. If I say my hand is a Nazir, my leg is a Nazir, I didn't say anything. Roshi Nazira, Tvedi Nazira, but if I said my head is a Nazir, or my liver is a Nazir, Hare is a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. Maybe your head, I don't know, you don't shave your head, but what does your liver have to do with being a Nazir? Zehaklal. source tells us, here's the rule. You want to know what the difference is, my hand and my leg versus my head and my liver? What I'm really saying is my whole body is a Nazir. Okay? If I'm saying my whole entirety is a Nazir, I'm a Nazir. If I say a small part of my body is a Nazir, I'm not a Nazir. So head and liver are things that my body is dependent on. If you get rid of my head, chop it off, I'm dead. You take out my liver, I can't survive. Those are things that my survival is dependent on. Okay, not that we should do this, but if you chop off my arm, I could live without an arm. I could live without a leg. So what they're saying here is, if it's something I need for survival, and by the way, there's a lot of sources that talk about this kind of thing, which is when I talk about a part of my body that's needed for survival, I mean my entirety, my whole body. When I talk about a part of my body that's not needed for survival, then it's not, I don't mean my whole body. And then I just mean some part, and this, it's an irrelevant thing for Nazirut. If I say part of my body is going to be a Nazir, that's not a taking upon myself Nazirut. So what's the issue? If I say my hair, I can obviously cut my hair and still survive, right? So therefore, if I say my hair or my mouth, I could seal my mouth shut and I could somehow get food intravenously. I don't know. I could, I could function without those, again, what it means really function, but it's not that if you remove them, I don't know how you remove a mouth. That's what I was thinking, maybe of sealing your mouth or something. The point is your life is not dependent on these parts of the body. It's certainly not your hair, in which case, how could this be taking upon yourself Nazirut? So Amar Rabbi Yehuda basically says, don't compare that to these cases. This is a different thing. This isn't like saying my hand is a Nazir, which doesn't mean anything. It's the Amar Hachi. It's where you said the following. You didn't say just my mouth is like your mouth and my mouth is a Nazir, basically. What you said is, Yaset pi kepiv miyayin. My mouth will be like your mouth, that I will not drink wine or eat grapes, like your mouth is not eating grapes or drinking wine. V'sari kesaro milagos, and my hair will be like his hair or her hair, that I will not cut it. And then you're basically, which is probably what you thought in the beginning, that these are things that relate to the actual Nazirut and not just random parts of my body that I'm saying part of my body will be a Nazir or my whole body will be a Nazir, and then it has nothing to do with that. Okay, next. Now we're going to get to the last part of today's stuff, which is the second big question of today. Again, to review, we have Reish Lakish who said, toch dibur. We brought two sources to try to prove. One, we succeeded, one we didn't. Like I said, today's almost all Tanaitic sources. Then we brought a question. Is when one says va'ani, is it going back to person number one, or is it going to the person just before them, which has relevance for the toch dibur issue? Can you keep going on forever, or can you only do one, right? And that obviously also has relevance for if one person undoes. They didn't even tell you this, but it's obvious. One person that does their vow, how does it affect all the successive people? So then we brought 3 lines from our Mishna, unsuccessful, but then we brought an explicit braita. Then we brought this other Tanaitic source to contradict our Mishna about the hair and the mouth, but we resolved that because we said it's not the same type of thing. Now we're moving on to our last question. So now that's just a quote from our Mishna. Our Mishna says, we didn't get to the question yet. If you say I'm a Nizirah and your husband hears and says, and me, then he can no longer nullify the vow. You might remember yesterday I brought 2 different explanations. We're going to see both those explanations today. Ibaylahu. If you don't remember, we're going to review it now. So Ibaylahu, they asked the following question. Baal me'akev akav o dilma megas ganis. When we talk about Hadran nidarim, we already learned that what happens, you go back and it undoes the vow from the beginning, right? That's what we have petach or charata. I regret, if I had been angry, right? I didn't realize, if I hadn't been angry, I never would have said this, or had I realized the ramifications, I never would have made it, and it undoes your vow from the beginning. Now, we talked at the time of Paparat Nidarim that it's not necessarily the same, and it seemed pretty clear even from Nidarim, most of the opinions said it's megas gayas. It cuts it only from here going forward. Okay, but now we're going to ask that question, and unfortunately today we won't get to an answer. Maybe tomorrow we'll be successful. We're going to continue this sugya tomorrow. So, when the husband nullifies the wife's vow, is it going all the way back to the beginning and it was as if she never vowed? Or is it like he's cutting it just from here, but it actually was valid all that time? I said this is going to have the same structure as before. What's the practical relevance of how we answer this question? For a case similar to the case in our Mishnah, where the woman takes on to be a Nazirah, her friend hears and says, me too. So let's say I became a Nazirah, you said, and me. And then what happened? My husband heard that I became a Nazirah, didn't like it. He undoes my Nazirut. So, if we say he does it from the beginning, then I was never a Nazirah, and you took upon Nazirut based on me, and I'm not a Nazirah anymore, you're not going to be a Nazirah. So, you're also going to be permitted. But if we say the husband only cuts it off starting from here, moving forward, and yesterday you already said, I'm going to be a Nazirah just like her, or whatever it was, it could have been the same day, as long as it was an hour before or a few minutes before, so I won't be a Nazir anymore, but you will be. So it's a very important nafkamina. So what's the answer? Tashma, let's learn it from our Mishnah. The first source is going to be our Mishnah, then we're going to go to two other sources. So now we go to that same case, but with the husband himself. Husband, actually, he said, and me, he cannot nullify the vow. Now, if you remember, we said there were two possible reasons why. So first, the Gemara is going to think it's one and think that will answer our question. If we think that he's cutting it off only from here on in, we assume the problem is, why can't he undo her vow? Remember why? Because if he undoes her vow, that undoes his vow. And if it undoes his vow, he's basically nullifying his own vow, which he can't do. He can't do hatara, dissolving of his own vow. He can only nullify his wife's vow, but if nullifying his wife's vow undoes his own vow, he's not allowed to do that. So it must be the Baal Megas, right? If we said Megas Gaius, it's from here on in, then like fairly he theoretically could nullify her vow, and then she wouldn't be a Nazirah, but he would be. And therefore, it must not be, because the Mishnah doesn't allow for it. Why does the Mishnah allow for it? We're assuming right now it's because his undoing her vow affects him as well. And he can't, again, what did we learn yesterday? Which we learned already before, which is you can't undo your own vows. You can only undo, a husband can undo his wife's vows, but he can't undo his own vows. And by undoing his wife's, it's undoing his, and that must be because because it's limafre, it goes all the way back. To which the Gemara says, right, so therefore you can infer from here, he must be uprooting it from the beginning. That's the first answer. To which the Gemara rejects this and says, really, the husband is cutting it off only from here on in. And that's not the reason why he can nullify the vow. It's a different reason. Really, theoretically, he could nullify her vow. And it doesn't affect him at all, because it's only from here on in. That means if Tuesday morning, she took the vow at 10 o'clock. At 10:01, he said, me too, or 10 in a few seconds, he said, me too. He became a Nazir. When he undoes her vow at 11, her vow was still valid at 10:01 when he said, and me. So therefore, he's still a Nazir. To which they say, Ubedinu, so therefore, theoretically, he could have undone her vow. But what's the reason? It's a different reason, not what you thought. And I said this yesterday, why? When he said, and me, he was basically ratifying her vow. And what are the laws once you ratify a vow? Unless you undo the ratification, which we're assuming you didn't, you can't nullify the vow. So therefore, if he undoes the ratification, then he could undo the vow. But the Mishnah was talking about where he didn't undo the ratification, in which case, if not, he can't nullify her vow. So basically him saying, oh yeah, I'm with you, right? I'm going to be a Nazir just like you, is obviously, or at least the way the Gemara is assuming now, is he's basically saying, oh, it's great that you became a Nazirah. Once he says it's great you became a Nazirah, unless he erases those words by going to a Chacham and getting him to undo them, he can't actually nullify the vow. So that's why the Mishnah says that he can't nullify the vow, because he already did Q, but it has absolutely nothing to do, right? And then you could read the Mishnah as Megas Gai, is that it's only moving forward. So that was our first attempt, unsuccessful, because it could be read in both ways. Hashma, next source. She became a Nazirah. She already separates animals to bring her sacrifice at the end of the process. Then the husband comes and nullifies the vow. The whole question is, what happens to those animals? Normally, you sanctify animals, they're sanctified. And one of them was for a sin offering. And there's a unique law by sin offerings. We're going to get to this many times in the Shas. There's 5 sin offerings. For example, if I bought a sin offering and then I died before I brought it. So there's nothing you can do with that animal. It was sanctified for a sin offering that I ended up not being able to use. And it's left to die, that animal. You just have to leave it and it'll eventually die and you can't do anything with it. If I lost the animal and then I took a different animal and I brought that for my sin offering, and then I found the original animal. So again, there's nothing I could do with that animal. Those are some examples of a chata'at shemeta. So now we have this animal, she designated. What happens to that animal? It really depends if it was his or hers. So remember, she doesn't usually have her own stuff. Usually she gets from her husband. So this one's not actually relevant to our purposes, but we'll go through it. If it was his, he gave it to her, but then he undid her vow, and he really didn't want her to be an Nazir. So he says, listen, the animal wasn't yours to sanctify. I can't sanctify something that's not mine. The husband, now there's different ways to understand this, but the husband kind of gave it to her upon condition. If you need it for the sacrifice, it'll be yours. And then she sanctified it. But when he undoes her nizirut, it's as if, right, it was never, or he basically said, now she doesn't forget about going backwards or forwards. It doesn't really matter. At this point, she doesn't need it for the sacrifice. And he says, it's my animal. You have no rights to do anything with it. I only gave it to you if you needed it for your sacrifice. You don't, it goes right back to me. And it's not sanctified at all. It's an interesting way where you can actually get rid of the sanctity. But here's the important part. If it was hers, the animal's left to die. Now, if we're saying that he erased it, then basically anything that happened with this whole process is erased from the beginning. So she was never in Nazirah. The animal was never really sanctified because it was sanctified for something that never existed. So it was as if it was never sanctified and it should go back and be fine. Why does it have to be left to die? It shouldn't have sanctity to it anymore. To which the Gemara says, so therefore, so it must be that it's only from here on in. And at the time, it really was sanctified. She really sanctified it because she really was still in Nazirah. Even later when he undoes it, it's not undone retroactively. To which the Gemara says, no, you can't prove it from here. Really, he uproots it from the beginning. But this is a unique halacha by a korban chatat that was designated. This is like hainu tama. The reason for this is kevan delot tzricha kapara. Now that she no longer needs atonement because he erased it from the beginning. Okay, let's say we go with that option. He erased it from the beginning. She still separated the animal and sanctified, and it was her own to sanctify. So it's like what? It's like it's like a chatat where the owners died because there's no more need for the korban anymore. Why is there no need for the korban? Because he wiped out her nizirut, but it doesn't mean she didn't sanctify it. In which case, and we have a tradition, the chatat where the owners died has to be left to die, and that's why, not because it only got undone from now. No, she really wasn't in Nazirah because he erased all that, but she did sanctify the animal and it was her own to sanctify. When it was his, he could say, I never gave you the animal to sanctify for no reason. So he could take it back. But when it was her own, her sanctification works. And that's why, but not really having anything to do with whether he undoes it from the beginning or he undoes it from here on in. So that didn't really help us. Third source, which also is not going to help us. This seems like a very obvious mission, which is what the Gemara is going to say. A woman who becomes a Nazirah, she's no different than a man. So therefore, if she drinks wine, if she becomes impure of the dead, if she, just those two things, they say, she gets lashes. Hefidami, what's the case that she gets lashes for these things? If we're talking about a regular case, I took upon Nazirut, my husband didn't do anything, he didn't nullify it. I'm a Nazirah. They don't need to tell us this. It's obvious. Why should a woman be any different than a man? Torah says, Isha. Obviously, I'm going to get lashes just like anybody would get lashes. It must be that he nullified my vow. And now, what are we saying? Right? Basically, on Monday, I became a Nazirah at 10 o'clock in the morning. At 11 o'clock in the morning, I became impure to the dead. And at 12 o'clock, my husband nullified my vow. To which they're coming to say, I get lashes for what I did at 11. Why? Obviously, because when he nullifies it, he only nullifies it going forward. If it was going backwards, I wouldn't get lashes because I was never really a Nazirah. So that's what we're going to read inside. Why should she get lashes? Guys, it must be he cuts it from here, moving forward from 12 o'clock, which did at 11. She was still in Nazirah. To which the Gemara says, no. What did we reject? We said, maybe it has nothing to do with he was made fair the neder. Maybe it's just a woman who was in Nazirah. So, but that's weird. It's kind of obvious. Well, they say the following. Really, he uproots it from the beginning. And if really what I just described, at 10 o'clock I became a Nazirah, at 11 o'clock I became impure to the dead, at 12 o'clock my husband nullifies my vow, I actually wouldn't get lashes for it. And that's not what this is talking about. Now, why then would it be talking about a rig? What's really talking about is if at 10 o'clock I was in Nazirah, at 11 o'clock I drank some wine, or I became impure to the dead, and my husband never nullified my vow, then I get lashes. Why are you telling me this? Well, they're telling it to foil it to the next case. Compare it to Mishum Tekadani Sefer, because it says after that, what if at 10 o'clock I took it upon myself? At 12 o'clock, my husband nullifies my vow, but he doesn't tell me. And at 1 o'clock, I go and drink some wine. I didn't know I wasn't in Nazirah. I thought I was in Nazirah, but I drank wine anyway. Right, one or the other. I don't get lashes. Why not? Because he nullified it and I'm not in Nazirah. Even though I don't know it. I think I'm doing something wrong. It's a fascinating case. Think I'm doing something wrong. I don't get lashes for that. Tanna, now why? Now what's the whole point? That's why they taught the obvious case. What they're saying is, if I did it at 11 before he nullified, or if he never nullified, I get lashes. That's why Tani Nami Reisha Sofeg. They're bringing that case to show, but I won't get lashes, even if I do it intentionally, if it happens to be after my husband already nullified it. Even if I don't know about it, then I won't get lashes. So they want to compare the two cases, and that's why they're bringing an obvious case to begin with. So again, it doesn't tell us anything about when he nullifies it, is it retroactive or from here on in? And we're still left with that question, and we'll get to that tomorrow. So like I said, two big questions on today's daf. One relating to when you say vani, which person is it going back to, the person just before or the first one? And the other big question was the woman, when the husband nullifies her vow, is it from the beginning or is it just starting from this moment going forward? And then we had two other side things about Reish Lakish and about the question about my hair like your hair, etc. But that was the main bulk of today's daf, and we'll continue with this sugya tomorrow. Wishing everyone a great day.